Hello everybody and welcome to the Tuesday edition of Video Clips. And on March 9th, some of you knew about this because you saw my previous video clips and I wrote about it and talked about it quite a bit. I was honored to be a presenter at the first conference held by the Institute for Scientific Freedom in Copenhagen. And I promised before I left that I would report back to you on some of the highlights. And my gosh, there's so many highlights. It will take several video clips to actually tell you a lot of what went on there and some of the important things that were discussed during the presentations and among ourselves. The first thing I want to say is I'd never been to Denmark before, never been to Copenhagen. It is a great city, beautiful, clean city with really fabulous food for people like me. I was surprised. And I also want to thank Dr. Peter Goethe, who was the organizer of the conference and the guy who had been ousted from Cochrane. I'll come back to that in a minute. What a great host. I mean, he went out of his way to make everything nice for everybody. Got an opportunity to meet his wife, and this will not shock you. She's a brilliant woman. She's a microbiologist, and I enjoyed talking with her very much. In her own right, she is a well-recognized scientist in Europe. So not shocking that a brilliant guy has a brilliant wife, right? So I kind of expected that. We were at Dr. Goethe's house. Some documentary makers were filming interviews with all of us. They're turning this whole story into a documentary. And I think what a great sport this woman was. She comes home from work and they've taken her family room and turned it into a film production studio, and there are humans, scientists in every room of the house carrying on conversations, and she was like, "Oh, nice to meet you all," and that was kind of funny. But anyway, for those of you who don't know about the events leading up to this, what happened is Dr. Peter Goethe, formerly of the Cochrane collaboration, was ousted from the organization last fall after choosing to take a stand on several issues. And those issues, the three big ones were, number one, that money was starting to corrupt some of the Cochrane reviews, and in fact, they recently took a large donation from the Gates Foundation. And of course, the whole idea is for Cochrane to be a third party that doesn't have a financial interest in any particular point of view or special interest group. The second thing was scientific fraud and misconduct concerning the HPV vaccine and the psychiatric drug issue. And those are sacred cows of medicine, as you know from listening to me all this time. After being ousted from Cochrane, Peter was subsequently dismissed from his position at the hospital in Copenhagen. And so intent on pursuing not only the truth about these issues, but other important issues related to health and medicine as well, Peter Brennan attempted to assist him by helping to form a new organization. We actually did it sitting at this desk, Dr. Brennan and I. When he was here in Columbus for our conference last fall, we were on the phone, on a speakerphone with Dr. Goethe, came up with the name, reserved it right away, and the Institute for Scientific Freedom was born. So let me tell you about this. The idea was, let's hold a conference, let's draw a lot of international attention to the issue of scientific integrity and bring together scientists and practitioners and reporters and others who have an interest in the issue. And my gosh, the media was there. There were two representatives from the European Union Parliament. There is a lot of interest in this issue. So I'll tell you some details. The first thing is that I showed up thinking that I was beyond being shocked. And because I've seen the worst of medicine for so long, it's what I talk about in these videos, and I figured that I would be interested in what the various people had to say, but I have to say that medicine hit a new low when I heard the presenters present their stories, and I'm going to tell you about what these stories were and the scientific research behind them today and in the next few video clips. So however bad you think it is, it's actually far worse than that, and that's the bad part. But then by the end of every presentation, the thought that you came away with is how incredibly principled some people are. They dug in their heels. They refused to be pressured into doing something that was not ethical or moral, at great peril and sacrifice to themselves. People lost their jobs. One guy had to come up with 300,000 English pounds to defend himself. And I'm going to tell you all about these things in this episode and the next few episodes of video clips. And so your faith in humanity got restored, that there are a lot of people. I mean, we filled up a whole day's program with people who are willing to take a lot of heat while telling the truth about things. And so I felt like I had a lot of good company, and there's hope for the world. That's the way we left. And Dr. Brennan and I were talking about it on the plane back to the States, and what were our impressions? And you might listen to all this and say, oh my gosh, it's awful. But we actually came away really positive about the things that can happen with like-minded people who get together, who have a lot of energy, a lot of integrity. So more to come on the Institute itself, and I'll just focus on the speakers and what they had to say. So the conference, Dr. Gercha opened the conference and introduced Dr. Brennan, and he started by talking about why we need an institute, an organization committed to scientific freedom. He told his own story of standing up to big pharma and organized medicine and his colleagues in academic psychiatry and many other institutions, which set the stage for the entire day. I don't know how many of you know the story, but Dr. Brennan used to be a real frequent guest on a lot of national television programs like the Oprah Winfrey Show. This was before Big Pharma had bought all the media, which you can't do that anymore. Anyway, he was on the Oprah show. She had chosen to do a show on survivors of psychiatry, and that might have even been what it was called, I'm not sure. But in any case, she had several patients telling their story, and then Dr. Brennan was there to document that, yes, this type of thing is happening in psychiatry. And at the end of the program, it was a great education for people, and she asked Dr. Brennan, do you have any closing thoughts? And he said, yes, if you're in a psychiatrist's office and he prescribes a drug, don't argue with him, because that never leads anywhere good. Just put it in your pocket and leave and don't go back. That's all he said. Well, the next thing you know, the American Psychiatric Association was screaming and hollering, and they made so much fuss that Dr. Brennan was invited back on the Oprah Winfrey Show to debate the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He agreed to do it. And so the president of the American Psychiatric Association people who don't have scientific grounding just scream and holler, which is kind of what he did. And he was talking about there was no concern with tardive dyskinesia, the involuntary movements that you see people often adopt after they've been on antipsychotics for a while. No problem with that. And Dr. Brennan listened to him rant and rave a little bit, and then he pulled out from under his chair the guidelines from the American Psychiatric Association that specifically stated that psychiatrists should be aware of these types of side effects of the drugs, which of course made the guy incredibly incensed. And following this appearance on Oprah Winfrey, where Dr. Brennan just buried him with information. I mean, you don't have to be a violent or aggressive person. You just have information. It's terrible for the other side because they don't have evidence on their side. So following that, the APA tried to take his license away, his medical license away. And he ended up in a long battle. He won that case at great expense to himself. I mean, all of us have been through these battles. It always costs a lot of money, and it causes a lot of consternation, and it probably cuts your life short a little bit from all the worrying about this kind of thing. So I thought that was a great way to start, somebody sharing their own story about how hard it is to stand up to psychiatry. And of course, or medicine and drug companies, that sort of thing. And of course, Dr. Brennan said now, the drug companies control the media and the hospitals and the institutions, so there's no opportunity even for people like Dr. Brennan to have that opportunity again on a national television show to set the record straight about something. So another speaker, I'm going to share her story. Her name is Dr. Marianne Damasi from Australia. She was an anchor and a science reporter for ABC, which is the Australian broadcast company, not to be confused with ABC here in the United States. She started doing feature stories on health on a segment called Catalyst, and she decided to do one on statin drugs. And I don't think she realized by her comments that she was really poking a very big beast when she decided to make this information public. Lipitor is the most profitable drug in the history of the drug industry. By next year, it will have done $1 trillion in sales. Now, this is the biggest drug of all time, but there are a lot of other statin drugs in the same category. One of the reasons why Lipitor and statin drugs as a class have generated so much money is because the broadening of the market for the drug. It's a, a practice you hear me describe as disease mongering. In this case, medical associations like the American College of Cardiology, disease groups like the American Heart Association, government agencies like the FDA and CDC, and the drug makers work together to develop diagnostic criteria that resulted in more and more and more people being qualified to take the drugs. Now, there were problems with statin drugs from the get-go because, as some of you have come to know, the approval process for the drugs is so corrupted at this time. For example, run-in periods were used to qualify participants for the trial. Now, if you're not, for the various trials. Now, if you're not familiar with a run-in period, this is a period of time before the trial actually begins, when researchers do things like take people off all of their drugs, put them on the drug that they're going to test, give them placebo. What they're trying to do is get rid of the placebo responders and get rid of anybody taking the active drug who actually has side effects, so that the drug shows up really, really well in the clinical trials and it doesn't look like it harms very many people. So that's what was done. The heart protection study is an example. All participants took a statin drug for 6 weeks prior to the actual start of the trial, which resulted in 36% of the initial group being excluded from the trial. In this trial, the researchers reported, quote, and this is how it comes out, during a mean follow-up of 25 months, no significant differences had been observed between the treatment groups and the numbers of patients with muscle symptoms, other possible side effects leading to termination of study treatment, or elevated liver and muscle enzymes. That's because anybody who would have had those problems didn't get to be in the trial. In fact, 81% of the patients remained compliant with taking their drugs in this trial. But this is entirely different than what happened when the drug hit the marketplace. We all know that the side effects of statins are well known, and many class action lawsuits have been filed against the companies that make them. For example, Reuters reported in 2014 that almost 1,000 women had filed lawsuits alleging that taking Lipitor caused them to develop type 2 diabetes. And in fact, there's a great deal of evidence to support the fact that taking Lipitor increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Now, efficacy is another issue, and this is where the story gets really interesting. A study in 2015 reported, quote, "We conclude that the expectation that CHD could be prevented or eliminated by simply reducing cholesterol appears unfounded." I hope you understood that, okay? Drugging people to lower their cholesterol, it appears that that was unfounded. On the contrary, this is exact quote, "We should acknowledge the inconsistencies of the cholesterol theory and recognize the proven benefits of a healthy lifestyle." In other words, the drugs don't work, and we should be telling people to improve their diet and lifestyle habits. In an article about this issue published in a medical journal, Dr. Damasi writes, "There are concerns that the benefits have been exaggerated and the risks have been underplayed. Also, the raw data on the efficacy and safety of statins are being kept secret and have not been subjected to scrutiny by other scientists. This lack of transparency has led to an erosion of public confidence. Doctors and patients are being misled about the true benefits and harms of statins, and it's now a matter of urgency that the raw data from the clinical trials are released." So in other words, these drugs were approved without anybody, including the regulatory agencies, seeing the raw data. That should not happen. In spite of this lack of transparency, scientific misconduct during the clinical trials, and the lack of efficacy and safety for statin drugs, the U.S. National Cholesterol Education Program revised the definition of high cholesterol in 2005 by lowering the threshold so that more people would be qualified to take the drug. There was no evidence that this would be beneficial, but rather based on the idea that lower cholesterol just always must be better. This is not surprising, since 8 out of the 9 members on the panel were on the payroll, had direct ties to the drug companies that make these statin drugs at the time that they served on the panel. 8 out of 9. In 2013, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association adjusted their guidelines based on the development of, quote, "new risk calculators," which served to broaden the market even more. Based on this revision, it was estimated that an additional 12.8 million Americans would be eligible to take statin drugs, with most of the increase in older adults who don't have cardiovascular disease. The U.S. wasn't the only place where this misbehavior took place. The National Institute for Healthcare Excellence in the UK also decided to reduce the threshold by half for prescribing statins on the basis of recommendations from a panel of experts. 8 out of 12 of these experts were receiving money from the makers of statin drugs at the time that they served on this panel. I mean, it's just so corrupt you can't even believe it, right? A key issue is the validity of the calculators, which were determined to be highly inaccurate. One research group reported that 4 out of 5 scores used in the calculator overestimated the risk of expected events by between 25 and 115%. Okay? As a result of the changed guidelines, the number of people taking statins increased, but the value of the drugs for most people was almost zero. One study showed that taking Lipitor reduced the risk of a heart attack by 1.1%, and another study showed that taking Lipitor extended lifespan by an average of only 3 to 4 days. How's that for a benefit? okay? Since the drug companies use run-in periods to mislead regulators and the public about side effects, well, how can we possibly know what the side effects actually are? Dr. Damasi reported that the Cholesterol Treatment Trialists Collaboration, CTT, led by Professor Sir Rory Collins, publishes data on statin drugs but does not allow anyone to verify its data or findings. When Dr. Damasi approached CTT for information, she was informed by the researchers that they had to sign an agreement prohibiting the sharing of any information given to them by the drug companies with any third party in order to get it. In other words, the drug companies are able to prevent the public from seeing the real data on side effects. Meanwhile, Professor Collins reports to the public that there are, quote, few troubling side effects associated with taking the drugs, but also says he has never reviewed all the data concerning the issue. So how can he make such a claim? In other words, I've never seen any data, but I think this stuff is great, right? You can't make this up. This is almost like a skit from Saturday Night Live if it wasn't so serious. After her investigation, Dr. Damasi produced a segment for the Australian Broadcast Corporation called The Heart of the Matter on this statin drug issue. The response was predictable. A disclaimer at the beginning of the show stated, quote, "The views expressed in this episode of Catalyst are not intended as medical advice. Please consult with your doctor regarding your medications." Yet Professor Collins said, quote, "It is a serious disservice to British and international medicine," and he claimed that doing this episode would cause patients to die. Merck, Sharp, and Dome, developers of the first statin drug, decided to conduct a survey of 150 doctors who reported that 40% of patients asking their doctors about statins had already stopped taking them. The other 60% wanted to. ABC's leading health expert, Dr. Norman Swan, said that as a result of the story, quote, "people will die." That's always what they say. It appears that the predictions of death were exaggerated. The same issue arose in France when a book covered the statin drug issue, and critics predicted that 10,000 people would die if they stopped taking statins as a result of reading the book. What actually happened? The number of deaths decreased following the controversy about statins in France. According to a subsequent review of data, statins are not beneficial for primary prevention. Discontinuation of statins does not lead to increased risk of events or death. And the researchers reported that discontinuation might actually save lives. The authors state that one of the reasons why statin discontinuation may reduce the incidence of cardiovascular events and death is that usually when people stop taking the drugs, they at the same time improve their diet and lifestyle habits, which actually is effective for reducing your risk of an event or death. They called for more research, but also stated that in the meantime, it is not evidence-based to claim that statin discontinuation increases mortality or that taking statins saves lives. Well, what happened to Dr. Damasi? Well, you won't be surprised about this, but complaints to the network from the medical cartel frightened the network, and she and her co-workers were forbidden to discuss the issue in public. As is often the case, the network shortly after found a reason to terminate her, and she is now a freelance reporter. It's unfair, and the unfortunate byproduct of this is that reporters will be very reluctant to take on these issues and report the truth about them because they can be assured that they will also be silenced or fired if they decide to tell the truth about what goes on in medicine. Very principled person. I enjoyed listening to her talk. And by the way, what I did after her talk is I dug up all the references and things that she was referring to and checked them out for myself and just to verify, you know what I always do. I always verify before I talk to you guys about anything so that I could make sure that, not that I didn't trust her, but I just wanted to make sure when I reported it to you that I was reporting the accurate information. So here's the way that this goes. Here's the way the whole thing works. And on Thursday, I'm going to give you another example. And next Tuesday, I'm going to give you another example. So the drug companies do not have to show the real data to the European Medicines Agency or to the FDA. The drugs get approved anyway. If you ask questions and you want to see data, you have to sign an agreement saying you won't share it with anybody, including making it public. In the meantime, people who've seen the data and understand that it doesn't support the use of the drugs report to the public that the drugs are great anyway. And then if you try to say anything that's contrary to that, they say you're killing people, everybody's going to die if they don't take their drugs, and then you get fired for speaking out, which is why I like sitting in this office. Who's going to fire me? I work for myself. All the really good information comes from outside the cartel. And so to a certain extent, Marianne Damasi's better off on her own as an independent reporter. I know financially it's probably not anywhere near what it would be to work for a big network. Dr. Gertz is better off outside of Cochrane. I'm better off not ever having been part of any of it. I know I've had a lot more freedom over the years. And so that's the state of medicine. So you have principled people standing up to people who are so bad you can't even believe they can be that bad. All right, hit the subscribe button, pass this on to anybody who you think would enjoy watching it, and I'll be back to you on Thursday with more news.